Except for World War II, nothing ever interfered with the celebration of National Suicide Day. It had taken place every January 3rd since 1920, although Shadrack, its founder, was for many years the only celebrant. Blasted and permanently astonished by the events of 1917, he had returned to Medallion handsome but ravaged, and even the most fastidious people in the town sometimes caught themselves dreaming of what he must have been like a few years back before he went off to war. A young man of hardly 20, his head full of nothing and his mouth recalling the taste of lipstick, Shadrack had found himself in December 1917 running with his comrades across a field in France. It was his first encounter with the enemy, and he didn't know whether his company was running toward them or away. For several days they had been marching, keeping close to a stream that was frozen at its edges. At one point, they crossed it, and no sooner had he stepped foot on the other side than the day was a dangle with shouts and explosions. Shell fire was all around him, and though he knew that this was something called it, he could not muster up the proper feeling, the feeling that would accommodate it. He expected to be terrified or exhilarated, to feel something very strong. In fact, he felt only the bite of a nail in his boot, which pierced the ball of his foot whenever he came down on it. The day was cold enough to make his breath visible, and he wondered for a moment at the purity and whiteness of his own breath among the dirty gray explosions surrounding him. He ran, bayonet fixed, deep in the great sweep of men flying across this field. Wincing at the pain in his foot, he turned his head a little to the right and saw the face of a soldier near him fly off. Before he could register shock, the rest of the soldier's head disappeared under the inverted soup bowl of his helmet. But stubbornly, taking no direction from the brain, the body of the headless soldier ran on with energy and grace, ignoring altogether the drip and slide of brain tissue down its back. When Shadrack opened his eyes, he was propped up in a small bed. Before him on a tray was a large tin plate, divided into 3 triangles. In one triangle was rice, in another meat, and in the third stewed tomatoes. A small round depression held a cup of whitish liquid. Shadrack stared at the soft colors that filled these triangles, the lumpy whiteness of rice, the quivering blood tomatoes, the grayish-brown meat. All their repugnance was contained in the neat balance of the triangles, a balance that soothed him, transferred some of its equilibrium to him. Thus reassured that the white, the red, and the brown would stay where they were, would not explode or burst forth from their restricted zones, he suddenly felt hungry and looked around for his hands. His glance was cautious at first, for he had to be very careful. Anything could be anywhere. Then he noticed 2 lumps beneath the beige blanket on either side of his hips. With extreme care, he lifted one arm and was relieved to find his hand attached to his wrist. He tried the other and found it also. Slowly, he directed one hand toward the cup, and just as he was about to spread his fingers, they began to grow in higgledy-piggledy fashion like Jack's beanstalk all over the tray and the bed. With a shriek, he closed his eyes and thrust his huge, growing hands under the covers. Once out of sight, they seemed to shrink back to their normal size. But the yell had brought a male nurse. Private, we're not going to have any trouble today, are we? Are we, Private? Shadrack looked up at a balding man dressed in a green cotton jacket and trousers. His hair was parted low on the right side so that some 20 or 30 yellow hairs could discreetly cover the nakedness of his head. Come on, pick up that spoon. Pick it up, Private. Nobody's going to feed you forever. Sweat slid from Shadrack's armpits down his sides. He could not bear to see his hands grow again, and he was frightened of the voice in the apple-green suit. Pick it up, I said. There's no point to this. The nurse reached under the cover for Shadrack's wrist to pull out the monstrous hand. Shadrack jerked it back and overturned the tray. In panic, he raised himself to his knees and tried to fling off and away his terrible fingers, but succeeded only in knocking the nurse into the next bed. When they bound Shadrack into a straitjacket, he was both relieved and grateful, for his hands were at last hidden and confined to whatever size they had attained. Laced and silent in his small bed, he tried to tie the loose cords in his mind. He wanted desperately to see his own face and connect it with the word private, the word the nurse and the others who helped bind him had called him. Private, he thought, was something secret, and he wondered why they looked at him and called him a secret. Still, if his hands behaved as they had done, what might he expect from his face? The fear and longing were too much for him, so he began to think of other things. That is, he let his mind slip into whatever cave mouths of memory it chose. He saw a window that looked out on a river which he knew was full of fish. Someone was speaking softly just outside the door.